Going to speak to the work that I've been at the University of Toronto over the last 3 years and focused on how to teach architects about the impact of their decisions. So it was kind of the title of this lecture is a whole life approach, thinking about a building, it's in its entirety. And I'm going to start with this famous correspondence between Buckminster Fuller and Norman Foster. It was written about 3 weeks after I was born in 1978, and it was posted. A friend of mine posted it from the Foster Foundation in Madrid 2 weeks ago, and I've been thinking quite a bit about what this letter means. And so it says, "Dear Bucky, I thought you might like to see the enclosed drawing, which I promised you when we were at the Sainsbury Center. It shows more clearly that my description of the gasket is not penetrated by the bolts. You also asked about the weight and the volume of the building, which are as follows," in which he then lists out all of the things in the building: the concrete, the steel, the aluminum, the mechanical equipment, and their tonnage. And what's kind of interesting to me in this is that this describes this building, this kind of, I think, iconic building, as I understand it to be, of its time. Not it being a kind of the high tech, of the British high tech. And I took that letter and I figured out the embodied carbon as if it were to be built today. And so on the right is the Sainsbury Center as graded, in today's kind of construction matrix. Not a particularly, say, low carbon building. And to think a bit more about what this building, why is it not low carbon? That's just the structure and the skin. So on the left, this real interest in, building a building much like an airplane, and so using things like aluminum or aluminium panels. And on the right, that's what an aluminum panel is. It's a bunch of ores extracted from parts of the world where this is contemporary aluminum. On the left, the Sainsbury Center. On the right, a bauxite mine. So these are the two sides of our supply chain, right? This is I would say, a representation of contemporary architecture, and by no means, as the Sainsbury Center alone, this is a part of, I would say, how we conceive our buildings and how we build them, and have been doing as long as I've been on Earth. So myself, I come to architecture and where I am right now, kind of in a roundabout way. When I graduated from the University of Toronto in 2008, I found myself working pretty quickly for an architecture and planning firm that did work with the resource development sector. So my first project was a regional plan for the Athabasca oil sands in Alberta. It's part of Alberta the size of the Netherlands, and I kind of drove down every road, and I spent a year, trying to figure out how to accelerate that development through the provision of additional roads and airports and where housing needed to go. And then I went on to live around the world working on copper and zinc mines and gold mines, in the middle of Panama, Ghana, Zambia, Mongolia, all on behalf of Canadian mining companies. And at that point, I look back at it, I was really kind of fascinated with this relationship that we had as a nation to extraction. Our history is based on extraction since we were founded. And then having left that job and joined Mass Design Group, where I can currently work, it was in a very similar geography. It was kind of in a jungle in the middle of a developing country, but here it was in Congo, and in this case was building a school, not building a mine. And this project with Mass Design Group, this is the most ambitious project that we've ever taken on, and made me really kind of consider the contrast between the construction of the school at Alima and this construction of, say, this copper mine in Panama that I was part of its creation. Alima, as a building, is incredibly audacious, the hardest part of the world I've ever traveled to, and getting materials and people to this place required, difficult to bring in all the things, to kind of think about bringing in aluminum, was not a consideration on this project, because materials had to come up the river to this barge landing in Pono, and then on the back of a motorcycle that, these dirt bikes that would go along the paths that are no wider than your shoulders in places, and would have to go over these single log bridges on the right to get to this school. And I think that is a kind of constraint. It's kind of the opposite end of that aluminum panel, really conditioned our thinking. And this is when the kind of hyper-locality of this project that, we sourced the bulk of the weight of this building, came within 10 kilometers, to think about weight again as a measure. And use things like the earth from the termite mounds immediately on site, using woods from the surrounds that we did a lot of testing to figure out, there's a species of endemic wood that has very similar characteristics to cedar. So we could use that for the roof shingles as opposed to importing, kind of galvanized sheet that would rust out quickly so that they could, maintain and replace as needed. And at MAST, we've always kind of been interested in the social impact of construction. And so we'd been tracking, through our projects, where did the money go? And this is, only $350,000 to build the school, but, the bulk of it went to labor. I think there's a kind of funny, even in this conception of materials and labor, there's no such thing as material cost, it's all labor cost. Everything is labor, right? And so within this 83% is direct on-site labor, right? As opposed to labor outside of the, say, parameters of the project. And then this was the first time we looked at embodied carbon too. So we worked with some researchers at MIT, who's now teaching at ETH, to do crunch the numbers on the environmental impact of the school. And it kind of was the aha moment for me. It was like, holy shit, what are we doing? Why is this number so much higher than a Lima, kind of embarrassingly low? What's the difference, right? And it kind of made me reflect a little bit back on those holes that I was part of digging in a way, but also what I was doing simultaneously. So at the same time as the school in Lima, I had just wrapped up the construction of this as our family's cottage, our summer home in the woods of Ontario that I designed. And it's off-grid, it's in the middle, much like a Lima, it's in the middle of a forest, a little easier to get to, mind you. And I thought I had done all the right things. The things I had been educated to do as a kind of sustainable architect, completely off-grid, thinking about passive heat gain, thinking about ventilation. This wood stove could heat the building in the winter on its own. But I had not thought at all about embodied carbon. I had not even heard that term when I went through school. So I went back and kind of crunched the numbers and figured out, well, what is the footprint of my decisions on that project as compared to a Lima? And they're pretty shocking. So it was like 92 tons this building represented, which means basically 92 years of me as a Canadian on Earth, right? It's my lifetime of emissions wrapped up into one project for my family. And only 10% were related to was wood, the kind of cutting and drying of this project that's almost completely, in my mind, a wood frame project, but it's not. It's a concrete project. I foolishly, I designed this concrete crawl space as the foundation, because that's how I've been trained to do. I hadn't even thought of any other foundation system. I didn't even think to pause. And so, this crawl space that nothing exists down there, save the occasional box of wine, represents more than half of the footprint. This represents, more than my life so far in emissions in that one decision. And that 58% of this cottage was due to petrochemical materials, both in asphalt shingles, which are the kind of standard roofing material of North America, and of the XPS insulation that was the frost proof of this unused space, right? So, Norman is not alone. I'm clearly here with him. I did not understand the weight of my building, right? And I did not, I think, in reflecting it, it was written up at Dwell at the time as this cottage is highly sustainable, the tightly insulated structure, ... And just to say, that tight insulation comes at great cost, right? It's those big blue circles. That is what sustainability is. This is not a sustainable building. It's anything but. And, reflecting on my education and the systems I work within. So, I'm a Canadian architect, and our government puts out these basically guide how to build small residential, wood framed house construction, as you can see, put out by the Canadian Mortgage and Housing Council. And in it, you go back and there's a contemporary Canadian construction of the 77 things in a Canadian home, 11 of them are made out of oil, right? So it's so kind of ingrained, not just in my education, but in the systems that govern us, right? It is so much a part of contemporary practice. In teaching at the University of Toronto, I asked a student, what is the history of insulation in Ontario? I had students look at the history of materials in the context of Southern Ontario. And and Ryan Brewer here was looking at like how insulation has changed, over time through different families. And what's interesting is, a century ago, things like wood fiber were kind of the standard. We had a lot of pulp and paper mills, and the byproduct of that could be, easily converted into wood fiber board. Today, you can't get it on the market. You'd have to import it from Germany if you wanted wood fiber board in your house in Canada. Cellulose was quite prevalent, up as late as the kind of 70s, right? And cellulose, again, a kind of byproduct of our forests. And what's it been replaced with? Foams, oil, right? And the kind of advent of why this stuff has happened. And it just does not take much stretch of imagination to realize the byproducts of petrochemical production needing to find ways into other parts of our marketplace. So, as late as, you can see 2021, this letter to then the Senate, advocating for, this is from the XPS Association of America, like, do not please allow us to keep practicing the way we're practicing, that we know it's highly problematic. So my friends at the KPMB lab, it's an office in Toronto, we're looking at the kind of time value of insulation as well. So in the context of Ontario, in a house that's completely heated and cooled, with electrical, in this case, this is a gas boiler. So if you had a kind of, your current high standard house, and you insulated your house with, DuPont XPS, basically this graph is, it would take, roughly 16 years of operations on that gas boiler for the initial emissions associated with that insulation to make sense, i.e., you'd be better off with, a sheet of Mylar around your house as your insulation for 16 years, right? And then you can see these other materials, they cross over in year one, yet very prevalent in our construction, as you've seen. And here's that same house if it's fully electric, i.e., that sheet of Mylar on an electric heating, that line will never cross over, right? You are better off with nothing on your building, just something to save the wind. Paper, you'd be a more effective construction in Canada. So the other kind of way to look at, back at my cottage was, where did all this stuff come from? And you kind of realize contemporary Western construction is global in its reach, right? Like this stuff's coming from all over the world. And I was interested in the windows specifically. I had a friend who worked at the window company, the fabricators back in Manitoba, where I'm from. And I was, so where did these wood-framed windows come from? And he's like, well, that's a complicated question. The glass comes from Missouri, but then it's tempered in Colonial, Ontario, and then it's brought back. Then we put it in the units, and then it's shipped back to where you are. The fur could either come from Oregon or BC, and then the spacers somewhere in Asia, and the hardware we get from Germany. Like, this is just the window, right? And it's moving across North America. You can see, that sheet of glass basically traversed the continent to get to my cottage. So in this light, I was kind of, I approached the University of Toronto 3 years ago to say, like, how do we have the embodied carbon of construction this decade? Let's go to a university to help figure this out. So for the last 3 years, I've been teaching both design studios, and this last year a seminar. So here's a view of our kind of mid-COVID final review 2 years ago. The HAF studio is pretty easy to understand why it's called HAF. It's this response to halving emissions by 2030. One of my heroes, I should have updated his tweet from yesterday here, the tip of the spear, as he said. And I think, looking that kind of these curves that we get from the IPCC and the basically having our reductions. I mean, what's interesting to me about this is that it's a building on the front cover of the report. It recognizes the proportionate responsibility we have. And so this simple kind of idea of the HAF studio, right? HAF by 2030, and we started in 2020. So that half of what, if you haven't seen this pie chart before, global emissions, buildings account for a minimum 40%. I'd say in Canada, it's much higher than that. In the UK, it's probably likewise. So that construction number, 11%, I think it's upward of 15 to 20 in parts of Canada. And so this wicked problem of how do we halve the emissions of all new construction whilst also having what we already have, right? And that retrofit has a footprint. Like this like conundrum of like the here and now is so profound, but we need to start somewhere. I think it's also important to think about like half of where, not just half of what. So I come from Canada, and as you can see, we are the worst. We are the single worst country of a G20 nation, only outdone by some Middle Eastern states that are completely dependent on petrochemical for their power production. So we have a long way to go. I'd say as a North American, our 50% reduction looks a lot different than the 50% reduction my colleagues in the office in Rwanda, right? Like, huge difference here. And so there's like no equivalence in this. We need to figure that out. Also, it should be slightly easier for us, right? You would think so. Like, losing the kind of first 20 pounds is easier than the next 20. I shouldn't be saying that, but and when we started out, I think as a precedent, look to the city of Vancouver. This is happening in Vancouver on the West Coast. It's there's action, and there was not much happening in Toronto whatsoever. So that's always a good thing to do, is get competing cities to say, well, they're doing it there, we should do it here. They had the wherewithal to peg their targets against a benchmark study. So in 2018, they went out and procured the study of contemporary construction, and like, what's the footprint today? Like, we need to measure something to improve against. And so that was my approach to the HAF studio. I was like, well, I'm going to do that. We're going to take 10 buildings. First year, we're going to look at housing in Toronto, because it's by square meter, by far and away the most of what's getting constructed, as a way to start the conversation and a way to provide some initial data to benchmark against. The second year, we looked at mass timber projects across North America, here in the UK and in Sweden. And last year, this past fall, we looked at the university's own buildings. And this time we coupled it with operational energy together, and to get that whole life view. Now, the way we do this, it's a third year's master's students, so this is their last year of education. But still, I think for a lot of them that hadn't worked in an office, their first time they're getting to specs and CD sets and kind of immersing them in the kind of the nitty-gritty of construction. Then we coupled this with utility data, and because we worked at the university, we got their actual, energy use, and basically beginning to sift through that. Interviewing firms for a lot of the time, it's I ask students to understand the building and then come to them and ask questions of why that, why this, what made this decision, why did you use that material and not this material, right? And it leads to these really interesting conversations, the kind of naivety of the student meeting the kind of preconceptions of the practitioner, and it's been really fruitful in the kind of back and forth and uncovering in that conversation, uncovering a lot of the kind of rules and reasons and codes and all the other things and kind of planning frameworks that are driving buildings, right? Architects are really, in a way, just executing the kind of forms that have been pre-described. We do kind of understanding, so we do field trips virtually and physically here. This is with the campus's utilities team and understanding how power in this case is distributed across the university, and visiting some of their new constructions. On the left, it's a brand new building with Fielding Clegg Bradley, and on the right, a building going up with Weissman Freddy. Now, the methodology is pretty simple. We do, for the life cycle assessment component, I have people, the students take a slice of the building, not the whole building. We only have a term. So I kind of use the metaphor of a cake. You need a slice of the cake to understand what it tastes like. So you can see we take a kind of structural grid. We then build a fairly detailed 3D model from it, and then use that to do life cycle assessment and quantities. So you can see here one of the Rhino models from the students with even the little pedestals modeled for the raised floor system. Then you kind of take that, and we use one-click LCA for the life cycle assessment, and some of the graphics that come out of this, overview of all the kind of players within. And then this, one student in the first year looking at the kind of the actual construction, and in the middle, the volume of that material, the kind of the weight of that, so to speak, and then on the right, the weight of it. It's the tonnage of it as a kind of carbon dioxide, so the volume of its emissions. And what's interesting here, you can begin to really see the correlations between where there's a lot of emissions with low volumes. You can see high yield materials. These are the different wood materials on it, and then there's my friend XPS at the bottom of this project here. So you can see off the charts on the right, and very little of it compared to the other stuff. Now, also last year, looking at where things are coming from, again, the kind of global reach of contemporary construction. Then we've married it with the operational data. So we take the baseline energy model. we calibrate that model, and then we compare it against that simulation with actual, and then put that out for a kind of full life view. And what's interesting of this last year is that uniformly every building used more energy than it was simulated. In this case, the delta was only 5%, but we saw upwards of like 30% with the building. So even our kind of energy models and codes that we think we're hitting, we're not close. And one thing that blew my mind, not as a mechanical engineer, was that like most of the new buildings specifically use heating in the middle of summer. So in the middle of a hot, humid Ontario day, we're taking central district heating to reheat air that had to be cooled to dehumidify it in these new buildings, which is insanity. So some observations from our studio. So what drives emissions? The first kind of simple thing, structures, carbon intensive structures. So Toronto invented fly-form concrete. We are addicted to the stuff. We use it, like crazy. So concrete was number one. Low-rise wood frame structures, still, like my cottage, most of its foundation was below grade. We also like to dig big holes. Mass timber, I think is promising if you account for biogenic storage, but on its own, the mass timber buildings, without that biogenic kind of accounted for, are roughly equal the concrete buildings. It's not the silver bullet. So here's an overview of the buildings from the first 2 years, and you can see there's like quite a big difference, and there's some correlation between height and total embodied carbon. I think the first year was interesting that these were all mid-rise housing projects, and the one on the left used hollow core slabs. And when we interviewed the architect, they're like, the client insisted on steel frame hollow core. We'll never do it again. It was so complicated, the detailing, et cetera, et cetera. Then we came back and showed the numbers like, wow, this is great. Like, I'm never gonna say no to that. And it's funny, like it's hollow core is something we used a lot in the 60s and 70s, and yet somehow has like fallen out of favor, right? And it doesn't take much imagination to realize why hollow core is way less than the other, because it's hollowed out. It's like its volume is cut in third. This is comparing two mass timber projects, the Adidas headquarters in Portland and the Catalyst building in Spokane, Washington. And they had the exact same, total embodied carbon per square meter, but you can see like one had roughly 5 times more wood in it. So are they the same thing? I think this is a kind of active discussion of how do we count for wood in this type of accounting. Basements, I think aside from just materials, how we build has a big part of it. So foundations, basement parking structures, below grade area. And so, Canadian housing, again, like my cottage, there's reasons why buildings are going down and not just doing slab on grade. I remember I first moved to Ireland when I was 19. The first thing I did in the house I was living in was look for the basement. I couldn't find it. And I remember my roommates were like, what are you looking for? And they couldn't understand what I was dumbfounded that the house did not have a basement, because in Canada, it's kind of assumed you do this, right? And this is all about planning law. So that the ground floor is a certain height above grade, it will count as that. It's still the ground floor of which you're allowed to kind of set your height limit to. This too is getting a kind of like a free floor of this. So it has everything to do with how we develop our kind of zoning and zoning policy around what's grade, what's your maximum height, how many floors, what's your coverage. All of these kind of zoning and zoning policy levers essentially lead us to go into the ground. On the right is a parking structure for a housing project. And then for the mid-rise and tall buildings, there's like a really big swing here. So, one building couldn't go underground because it was in a floodplain, so had a really small footprint, relatively speaking. And this one went down to accommodate minimum parking requirements, and it was built into what was an old creek. So they had to bathtub the structure. It's twice as much concrete and it has a sump pump running forever. So 50% of that building's total emissions exist to house its cars, which is insane. So you can see really big differentials across the city here. Now, the kind of kicker on this too is that the structure of parking, and parking again is a code thing, the parking minimums, and certainly most North American cities. Again, there's a height limit, you've got a coverage limit, and you have got a minimum parking. So that planning is pushing buildings down to accommodate that parking, and more often than not, your standard parking spaces, there's 2 spaces there, they never really match up with the ergonomics of like housing, And so the kitchen and your living room are not the size of your car, and thus quite often you see slippages between them. And this project, to accommodate, has a large transfer structure. The entire ground floor is a 1 meter deep, thick slab to accommodate that, right? Ridiculous. Here is kind of an overview of like North American basements. So on the left, kind of the basement I grew up in. On the right, what a lot of people, dump their money into, the kind of man cave on the right, same space. And when one student I was asking her to look at this project, which was a community housing project, and the tenants were basically the whole area was being redeveloped by Toronto Community Housing. Folks that had been living in housing that was built in the 60s were being relocated to a new project, and part of that, they insisted on having basements. Because it's a kind of free area, again, it's not in our coverage calculations. And so it's like, okay, well, what if we just relax the planning for a second, give them the same floor area, but do slab on grade, right? What would it do? Well, it basically cuts the total emissions by a third. And then I asked something kind of crazy, because we'd been doing a lot of stone foundations in Rwanda, and we found that that's where the bulk of our reductions were sitting. It's like, what if we did stone foundations as well? Like my grandparents' house, like most other houses in Toronto built before like 1925. What would happen then? And so this was like, wow, okay. So this is the same floor area, and this is the embodied carbon as it relates to the foundation systems of housing. So on the right, how our grandparents built, and on the left, how we're building right now. The next thing is envelopes. Now, architects, this is like fully our agency, enclosures, and here's aluminum re-entering the conversation. So, aluminum extrusion-based glazing systems like curtain walls and window wall, another invention of Toronto, carry the highest embodied carbon of any, building material per weight. So unitized window walls, et cetera. And then in stark contrast, to the first year's aluminum-heavy windows were a lot of the mass timber projects much more progressive in their materiality. So, the students go through and develop these kind of takeoffs of all the wall types, and just to say, like, contemporary projects have, so many different partition, types within it. And we did these, studies of what's the R value versus the embodied carbon. And so you can see on the left, fairly good R values or ratings with fairly low embodied carbons. On the right, the window walls of abhorrent thermal values and abhorrent embodied carbon. And then this was a kind of cross section of the mass timber ones the second year. So you can see a pretty big difference here, and even some envelopes that are wood fiber board and cedar shingles that could be arguably climate positive constructions. The next point that I want to kind of make is geography really, really matters. The provenance of materials has disproportionate impacts on global warming potential and the location of a building as well. So, to illustrate this, that project I showed you earlier, the brick stood out as like really high. Like, why is that brick so like? Why is it got such a large impact? And when we interviewed the architects, like, well, the local clay body, there's one large brick manufacturer in Toronto, and it's orangey brown. We wanted gray, we wanted something different. And so we found these gray bricks from Arkansas and Nebraska, right? And the first thought is because they come from far away that they've got higher, due to the transportation. But it's not. The transportation's like a fraction of the footprint. It's everything to do with where it's made. So this is the grid intensity map of North America. And you can see that basically for every kilowatt hour in that supplier in Arkansas, with an electric-fired kiln, it's 10 times more emissive than doing the same thing in Ontario. So if you're thinking about where things come from, this is the map that's important, right? Where's it on? And here's why. We have the benefit of living on nuclear and hydropower, and the folks in that part of the world, it's all mostly coal and gas. Now, kind of another version of this, when we looked at this as the Katerra headquarters, all the different materials, all the different kind of wood suppliers here, so Katerra's own sources, then Structure Lamb and Western Arc Rib for all the mass timber. And the student came to me and said, Kelly, I've done my embodied carbons. It's like it was almost twice the amount that the Carbon Leadership Forum, their own assessment of the same building 2 years ago. They're the experts. What am I doing wrong? And I was like, Ophelia, I don't think you're doing anything wrong. Go look at their report. And so she did, and there's that 207. It's like, okay. But what are the EPDs that they're using? And so EPDs are environmental product declarations that tells you the footprint of that material. And so you can see, this is a kind of symptomatic of like where we are in North America with this, that, when they did this study, only 15 of the 52 materials had specific EPDs, and that most of them were just generic. So that basically, here's mass timber for North America. And as I just shown you, that's not a very good proxy. So because, a few years later, she had specific EPDs for where the wood came from, and so here's a view of some of the sources of that project, kind of went from BC and into Alberta and even the state of Washington. And there's really big swings as a result. So the generic at the top had about 17 tons for 100 cubes, and the actual suppliers they had were, almost 10 times that in one case. So a tree is not a tree, it's where the tree is cut and dried that matters, not where it's grown. And the last kind of point to make then is that whole life view. So, if we're only looking at embodied or operational carbon, we're only seeing half the picture. It's how they work together over time that we really need to develop more understanding of. So to first look at this, we took four walls two from the first year and two from the second year's project. So it's the resi on the right and commercial mass timber resi on the left and mass timber on the right. And in each case, we had representations they are fully representative of the entire building, proportionate of window to wall ratio. And the question we wanted to say is, okay, what's the embodied carbon of these assemblies? So you can see, two things to point out. There's my friend aluminum. It sticks out. It's the frame. In this case, this is the kind of window wall assembly. And this is the aluminum window in the mass timber assembly. So the window frame in the aluminum case, the bulk. Window frame is also the bulk in the other two because they both had PVC windows. So in both cases, it's just the frame around the glazing. That's like the major point of the facade, right? And then there's the other things, some insulation, et cetera. Then we also looked at the operations of these. So we modeled out based on the U value, R value, U value of those two assemblies. So you can see these are the two residential assemblies, assembly 1, assembly 2. How their energy profile over time was different, right? This assumes heating and cooling, electric heating and cooling. And you can see, window 2 has a much sharper curve up because of its U value being so poor. And the window 1 even has a replacement, at year 30 for its PVC window per the warranty. So this does not take into account any issues that you're going to have with window 2 either over 60 years. But what you can see is from day 1, this wall is twice as emissive, and like by 60 years out, it's twice as emissive. And they're both doing the same thing. They're both cladding housing. So why are we doing one right now more often than one on the left, right? And then here's a view of all 4 walls over time. So these are the options you have in a project. This is the way we need to look at like buildings, right? This, I would argue, and by 2030, which one are you choosing and why? Now, to take it kind of a step further, we're like, okay, here is contemporary construction in Canada. This is what we're seeing. So big on the left, Frank Gehry on the right, 2 different cities. Here's 2 different cities. Again, that geography. If you're in Alberta, much like Arkansas, your power is mostly fossil fuel based. So the argument for embodied versus operational, you can see projects, this would be a high efficiency house, the exact same project built in 2 parts of Canada. Crossover year is happening pretty quickly. Crossover year, never happening there. So there's a big difference between building in these 2 parts of the country. And yet we have energy codes that are fairly similar across the country. So in the context, and this is in British Columbia, there's an office building going up, and now the code requires you to use triple pane glazing. Only a couple of years it was dual pane glazing. And so question we asked is does that make sense, right? Is that a good idea? Aside from never mind that it's all curtain wall. But take that as the starting point. Why add more layers of glass in a place like Victoria? This is, very temperate climate. And so we figured out, it doesn't make sense. Only in year 2068 does that make sense from an emissions perspective. That also means you're spending more money, you've got more structure. You're obviously going to have a little bit more mechanical systems too. But overall, I think we need to look at this question here, not default to the idea of it. And so taking that step further, presented this to some folks in Washington, D.C. last fall, wanted to add some American cities to it with this basic question of dual pane, triple pane, right? This is what we found. So these are the crossover years on today's grid emissions, and you can see in cold climate, dirty grids, makes sense. In places like green grids or temperate climates, never makes sense. And yet our code's pushing us this way. And the other thing is this does not account for grid decarbonization. So as we decarbonize, these dates move further and further right, which makes it even more problematic. Finally, I think this policy work, this studio has the data and the kind of benchmarking has rolled up into ongoing policy work with the City of Toronto. So kind of the Trojan horse of the host studio was to bring in a debate to the city. And so we said, here are the numbers. And they said, that's very interesting. Let's expand the study. Let's bring in industry and let's work on this together. So this wrapped up last fall. The second city in Canada to have now embodied carbon policy being implemented to regulate future construction. In that, they asked us to look at their own procurement. So the city, builds a lot of buildings. In this case, it was a emergency services building for their ambulance fleet. It's a garage. Said, can you look at our own building and tell us like how it's doing, how it would be impacted? So we did a life cycle assessment of it, and things that stuck out, obviously like XPS stuck out, but the epoxy coating on the floor of the garage was something like, okay. So we came back and with the architects and their construction manager said, I think we could just now in this really late stage, you can make 6-7 changes that should have no impact. And they went back and in fact, they didn't cost anything more, and in one case, they accelerated the construction schedule. They're like, yeah, we'll do them all, no problem. So right there was 800 tons of avoided emissions. So I feel less bad about my cottage. But that's now led to work that we're just about to start with the city on looking at their design guidelines and how these things kind of influence emissions unintendedly, like things like the parking minimums and coverage and all the things in planning law. And yeah, just to kind of conclude, so like where we are and where we need to get to, I think this leap to optimizing for embodied carbon is like step one, and looking at our kind of energy usage. But then beyond that, the next step would be that full-scale move towards, being in the room clearly, don't need to tell anybody, towards, retrofit and reuse and biogenic materials. And yeah, so this is what we're doing at the Half Studio. So a mixture of assessment analysis, a focus on policy, and then using education as a form of advocacy. Kind of the kind of spirit of the event is like we've been taking this and publishing it right away, and it's led to conversations and probably why we're here. Thank you.